Once again, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the 10th Annual Tribal Healing to Wellness Court Virtual Enhancement Training. You have joined session E4, Challenges to Taking the First Step, Engaging the Veteran Population in Treatment Courts, presented by Mark Panasiewicz. My name is Catherine Ratana, and I am a Tribal Law Specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. And as a reminder, this is our disclosure, and any points of views or opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the author and do not represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. And I am also joined by my colleague, Abby, and she will be walking us through those tech-related notes for today's session.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us. All the recordings will be made available on this platform and enhancementtraining.org. Thank you all for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Mark today to present.
Thanks, Abby. So my name is Mark Panasiewicz, and I'm a project director with the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, or NADCP. It is my pleasure to be here talking about veteran stuff. I don't know if you realize this, but for quite a few years, I was also a consultant and a speaker for TLPI before I got my current job with NADCP. So I've been to the enhancement conferences in person often, and it's one of my highlights of my year. So what I always try to tell people when we're doing these virtual things, a lot of times people will talk very negatively about it. And what I always like to say is, let's just look at it as different. You know, I know that there's things about being in person that are good, but there's things about this are good too. Like, how many of you are in still pajamas while you're doing this conference, right? We couldn't do that if we were at, Palm Springs or in Old Town in New Mexico. So just think of it as different, and let's try to make the best we can out of it. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to go over overall the workshop, which is engagement to the early identification of veterans. All right. And we're also going to look at some current innovations. We're going to talk about military culture, which is important, and we're going to look at cultural competence, and we're going to identify some communication skills when working with veterans that might help you guys out. Okay, so the very, very first thing I want to stress is you have to ask the question, have you ever served in the United States Armed Forces to include the National Guard and arrest? You want to ask that as many times as possible. You want to ask at arrest, at booking, pretrial services, first appearance, court appointed, when you have court appointed forms, or supervisor appointments. The reason why we want you to ask it in this particular way is because oftentimes veterans don't even realize they're a veteran. I've talked with veterans who thought the only way they could get veteran status is if they had served in combat, and that was the only way they thought they could get veteran status. So that's why we want to make sure that you ask this question and you ask it often. Have you ever served in the United States Armed Forces to include the National Guard and the reserves? Now, why don't we want to say, have you ever served in the military? Anybody? Because what if they served in the French military? Or what if they, I don't know if France has a military, but what if they served in a different military than ours? And that's kind of the point, is that if we ask them, have you ever served in the military, they might have served in a foreign military. And that's not necessarily the population you want to pull in. So we want to make sure we ask, have you ever served in the United States Armed Forces to include the National Guard and Reserves? That's a really good way to ask it, and it covers all the bases. Because again, oftentimes people in the National Guard and Reserves don't consider themselves a veteran. And I don't know if you realize this, but most people in National Guard and Reserves can't get services at Veterans Affairs unless they served a certain amount of time active duty, which I believe is 180 days, you know? And so they could have went down to Katrina and helped with the cleanup after Katrina and seen all these horrible things, but they still wouldn't be considered a veteran because they were only down there for like a month. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind, is we always want to ask, have you ever served in the United States Armed Forces to include the National Guard and Reserves? Okay, some ways we can do this, okay? And this is what we're going to try to encourage, is called self-identification, okay? Do you see that post right there, serving your country, now worried about serving time? There was a jail that realized they had a blank wall right in front of the nurse's infirmary desk. And so people would come in and sit down to do their paperwork for the nurse, and they were just staring at this blank wall. So their solution to that was to put up this poster. And what they started doing is they started seeing vets starting to self-identify. You know, I've heard of police officers that had something similar to this printed up on a business card. And when they arrested somebody, if they asked that question, you know, have you ever served in the United States military, to include the Reserve or the National Guard, if they said, yeah, they would just hand them the card, or they would slip it into their property. You know, I've seen trifolds at courthouses, bail bondsmen. You can make a trifold with this question or the question of, and put it at a bail bondsman to try to help them see that. You can also put it at their private defense bar. Okay. They also have VTC informational videos that you can get for jail, courthouse, and the public, so that your veterans who are identifying in those places can self-identify. All right. Okay, so here's the problem though, and I'm going to relate my own story. When I got out of the Air Force, I was a little wild, and I ended up getting in a bar fight and getting arrested for assault. And when they asked me when I was getting booked if I was a veteran, I told them no. All right, and I am a veteran. I'm a veteran in the United States Air Force. But I told them no, because I was kind of ashamed of the fact that I gotten in this fight and was getting arrested in the first place. And so they would have never known I was a veteran, because I didn't self-identify. I didn't say yes. And you'll see a lot of veterans, especially if their military service wasn't the shining point of their life, meaning that maybe they had a lot of trauma, you know, because that's when we talk about veterans, what we see is that some of them have the best experience and some of them have a really bad experience. And it just depends a lot on what their experience was in the military and the combat they've seen, or other things that could have happened that could create a PTSD type of situation for them. So the point is that sometimes veterans don't self-identify. And the reason, so we have this system here called VRSS. And if you reach out to any veteran service officer, they can tell you about it. But I'm going to give you a little brief overview of this, okay? So what ended up happening is the Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs, was seeing that we were having a lot of justice-involved veterans, and they weren't identifying them. And a lot of times the reason why they weren't identifying them is because the veteran themselves wouldn't self-identify. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to come up with a system, an automated system to locate veterans who are incarcerated in correctional facilities nationwide. So not just in one place, they wanted to do it everywhere. And they also wanted to look for veterans who had been charged or convicted in state or federal courts also. So what they came up with was this thing called VRSS, which is the Veteran Reentry Search Service. And what they can do is they analyze the records from prison systems and court systems, and then they get all that from the Veterans Affairs, and they can tell who was a veteran, whether or not they identify or not. So basically what you can do is you can request this service, and you can request it through the Veterans Affairs Department. And as long as you are part of the criminal justice system, you're allowed to get this system. And what it'll do is you enter in data fields, just like you would if you were booking them normally. And then you send that off to the veterans, the VRSS. And what ends up happening is it'll come back and tell you if somebody was a veteran, whether or not they identified or not. So what you could basically do is that whenever somebody's booked, you could run them through VRSS or just connect it to your current jail system, and it'll spit back who's a veteran and who's not, so you can start identifying that veteran population. Okay, this is the information they're looking for when they talk about on VRSS. I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of small, but it's basically you just log into their system, you enter that data, and then it'll spit back to you exactly whether or not somebody's a veteran or not. And if you look at that data, okay, name, social security number, date of birth, gender. Do you notice that that's the same information that they would take when they were booking you? So we're not talking about a big jump, and it's not a lot of extra work for the jail to plug this information in when they're doing the booking. Matter of fact, a lot of times this program will overlay right with the jail program, and it's compatible. And so as you're entering it into the jail stuff, it'll automatically enter it into the VRSS, and you can send that out at the same time. And then you can get that back. And this is important because a lot of times jails want to create things like what's called a veterans pod, so that they have all the veterans in one pod because of a certain military culture that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. But so this is the basic information you're going to gather up and collect. Here it is again on a bigger scale. Name, social security, date of birth, gender, prisoner identification number, their cell location. So you can see this is all the same stuff that the jail is going to enter anyways. Where does the information go? So my partner, David Peltier, designed these slides, and this is his favorite thing because he says it goes out into the void. And that's what he's saying, is that that's basically what it does. It goes out into the void, which is where the veteran information is at, and then it gathers it up and it spits it back. Okay, so engagement through the early identification of veterans within the criminal justice system. Okay, that's one of the things we want to do. The quicker we can engage with them when they enter the criminal justice system, the better the chances are of starting to change that behavior and getting them into a healing and wellness court. Okay? All right, cultural competency. Here's the thing. Military culture is vitally important to understand. Current and former service members that become justice involved have needs and risks that are required clinical and criminogenic interventions, which are culturally sensitive to them. So this is what I'm talking about. When we talk about military culture, we talk about things that are common traits that are kind of ingrained in whether or not what your family was like before you came in the military. When you come into the military, there's automatically some things that are just ingrained into your system. So some of those things are sacrifice. So has anybody ever heard the term, and I know you can't answer, but I'm going to just act like you are answering me. Has anybody ever heard the term, embrace the suck? No? Well, I'm going to tell you, sacrifice and discipline kind of go with that embracing the suck. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. Having a higher standard. I know with us, it was, you couldn't be second best, you had to try to be the best. Being part of something greater than just yourself. A brotherhood, a common bond that you have. Dark humor, that ties into it too. I'll tell you right now, I was a corrections officer before I was a therapist, and corrections officers and law enforcement in general have a dark sense of humor. We would tell jokes, and if I told them to non-correction officer friends, they looked at me in horror, you know? And there's also a concern about seeking care. That's kind of that part of embracing the suck, and then moral injury. So we're going to go into some of these things. Okay, so let's go back to embracing the suck, because I want to explain it now, because I think this is a good point. So in the military, it doesn't matter what you want. It's whatever branch of the service you need, their needs. So in the Air Force, it was Air Force needs. In the Army, it was Army needs, Marine needs. So their needs came first before you as an individual. And you had to accomplish your mission no matter what. So for example, if you had blisters on your feet and you had a 10-mile march, it didn't really matter. You're still going to do the 10-mile march. You know, you embrace the suck because you're still going to accomplish the mission no matter what. If that means you wrap your feet, then you wrap your feet, but you embrace the suck. And that's a really great thing when you're trying to fight wars and battles or accomplish an objective. But once you're out of that environment, that can be a really bad thing. So we talk about sacrifice and discipline. That's two of those things that I think tie into that embrace the suck, you know, or holding yourself to a higher standard. And it also ties in with teamwork. The problem with it is that you can embrace the suck so much that when you're not doing so well, you don't seek out services like you should. And so, for example, when we talk about moral injury or seeking care or suppression and denial, those are those things that embrace the suck kind of creates and helps to create, because you don't talk about how bad it was, you just embrace it and go on. You don't get help, you're too tough for that, you just embrace it and go on. And when we talk about moral injury, that's what we're talking about, is we're talking about these things that possibly went against what we were taught, but we had a job to do, so we had to do it. And so it creates that dual person inside of us, you know. Again, I'm going to go back to corrections because I've seen more things in corrections than I did when I was in the Air Force. But that's the thing, is that sometimes to survive in corrections, you have to be very, very cold. And that can really go against the grain of what you were taught to be. And that creates that moral injury and kind of creates that dual personality that you have. And I'm not saying that they're, you know, multiple personalities or anything like that. I'm just saying it creates a different person when you're at work than when you're not. Okay, the other thing we talk about is the warrior ethos that goes into military culture, okay? And that is a sense of purpose. If anything else, the military always gives you a sense of purpose because there's always a mission. And that's always what you're doing. And you're told to do this mission, and then you got to accomplish that mission, and then you move on to the next mission. In the Air Force, integrity was the code of conduct. That was what was expected, is you had a code of conduct that you had to follow. A lot of people don't realize this, but so I'll tell you a story about the next one about the code of conduct. I had a friend and myself, we went out, or there was like 3 or 4 of us, and we went to a beach and we were drinking when I was in the Air Force. And my friend ended up passing out on the sand, and he got a horrible, horrible sunburn because we were in Okinawa. Well, he actually got written up for it, and he got in trouble because they said he was damaging government property. And that's that code of conduct that went against, you did something that was against what the military wanted. Same thing when we talk about, like, if you write a bad check in the military, you're going to get in trouble by your boss, because the bank's going to call, not you, they're going to call your boss and say, hey, listen, this guy wrote a bad check and we want you to know about it. And your first sergeant will come down on you like a ton of bricks. And if you keep doing that, you can get a bad code of conduct, you know? The other thing that the military has in common is a common purpose. Everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing, you know, and that tends to give an identity and some morality. And again, selflessness, you know, and sacrifice. That's that embrace that suck. You just do what you got to do. And you have a loyalty to your brothers and sisters. And with that comes honor. And so part of this, the reason why we're going through this, because I know this is identifying veterans and how to identify veterans. But here's the thing, if you don't understand the culture of veterans, if you don't understand the way they tick and the way they're thinking and the experiences or something of their culture, then what's going to happen is you might identify with them, but you're not going to connect with them. And if you can't connect with them in some way so that they can understand that they trust you, then you're not going to accomplish your goal anyway. So that's why we really want to go through the importance of making sure you understand the cultural identity and everything that goes with that, okay? Okay, so one of the things that we want to talk about, so you have an understanding about the military, is we're going to talk about the impact of transition. So first of all, discharge and out processing. Now, well, discharge and out processing. So when you decide to leave the military, there is not a huge, long process to do this. You basically go to a base, you stay there a week, they give you a physical, they ask you some questions, and then you're out the door, okay? And when you go out that door, you feel disconnected from the military brothers and sisters you had, but you're also not very connected in civilian society. And when that can occur, you feel that loss of support, because before you had a family system that was protecting you in the military. And I truly feel like that's what it was, because if you needed something, the military was there to give it. They gave you food, they gave you housing, they gave you shelter, they paid your electric bill. I mean, everything was pretty much wrapped up and taken care of when you were in there. So you had an incredible support system in the military. And if you needed help, there was tons of places to go and get help. And you also had an identity. You were Airman P-10, the crew chief for an F-15. And by the way, they call me P-10 in the military because it was P and then 10 more letters past my last name. But even that, even having a nickname like that, made me have a sense of identity, made me a connection with them. You know, and when my first sergeant would say, P-10, you did a great job with that, it was a huge deal. You know, and so there was that connection and that identity of being somebody. When I out-processed from the military, I went from working on multi-million-dollar jets to bagging groceries within a week and a half. You know, and you want to talk about a loss of identity. It was just mind-blowing, you know. And the other thing I lost was kind of my purpose. You know, I knew exactly what my purpose was in the military. And it was appreciated too. You know, when you did your stuff and you did your purpose, it was appreciated. And a lot of times, people getting out of the military with this quick deployment or redeployments and getting home and leaving and all this stuff. But when they finally get out, a lot of them don't know where to go for assistance. Like when I got out, I didn't even know I could apply for unemployment. You know, I got lucky and bumped into another veteran and he told me about it. And so I was able to get some unemployment when I first got out. But, you know, there's not a big thing now about where to go for assistance. And again, you can say, well, why wouldn't you just go to the VA? Well, again, a lot of people don't qualify for VA services, even if they are a veteran, even if they were in the military. You know, there's a very specific thing. If I get out of the military and I get a halfway decent job, I might not qualify for VA services just for the simple fact that I make too much money, you know? And so these are all things that we need to look at when we're talking about understanding our veterans and getting an idea at least where they're coming from. I don't ever want you to tell somebody that you know what they're going through, but it's good for you to know what they're going through, or at least have some sense of an idea. Okay, so here's the first thing. I want you to ask questions and listen. Asking questions is easy. Listening is not always so easy. Oftentimes what we do is we ask a question and we already start thinking what the other person's response is. That doesn't create a very good environment for listening, you know? And so you need to ask questions. And what I mean by that also is don't fake like you understand the military. Ask questions. Ask them, where did you serve? Ask them, what was your job or your MOS, you know? And then listen to what they say and take a genuine interest in it. That's a big part. Build trust and respect, but I think you do that by showing concern. And you show concern by being genuine. This is important because a lot of times in the military, we can kind of sense when somebody's being genuine and when they're not, you know? And if you're showing concern, but you really don't have that feeling, then that's going to do the exact opposite. It's going to make distrust and they're going to lose respect for you, you know? And so you want to show concern by showing that you care and listening. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about trauma because this is important. Trauma is trauma, okay? And what I mean by that is that what one person feels is trauma, another person might not. When I was a corrections officer, I got stabbed in my shoulder right here. And it was a bad thing. It was horrible and all that, but I never really had any trauma from it. And I don't know why. However, about 6 months after that, one of the guards that was training me got pulled into a food slot and his arm got broken and the inmate was trying to pull off his arm like a chicken wing. That created a lot of trauma in me. You can't judge what one person's trauma is because it's not based on the event, because the event is subjective to what we feel is trauma and what isn't trauma. It's built on the way the brain of that individual person can adapt to it. I am telling you right now, I have a St. Bernard. He's 206 pounds and he's a cuddler and he's my best buddy in the world. I guarantee you when he passes, I'm going to have some trauma. Okay. Other people, their dogs pass and it's sad, but it's not that big a deal. You know, so trauma is trauma, you know, and you can't say, well, this person was just beaten up and this person was shot, so the person that was shot should have more trauma than the other person. It just doesn't work that way. And if you start having judgmental trauma, like judging whose trauma is bigger or less or anything like that, you're just creating a situation where you're not showing concern, you're not building trust, and you're not showing respect. So you need to understand that if somebody comes in and says, my trauma, yeah, here, I'll use this example. I have a friend of mine he owns a marina that I have my boat at, and he was in the Navy and he was in Vietnam. And part of his job at Vietnam was taking the deceased bodies and putting them in a cooler so that they could get them home and get them taken care of. Well, one day a friend of his was walking by and he opened up that cooler and said, yeah, come on in here with me. And that guy's seen all those dead bodies. Well, flash forward 20 years later, you know, and we're sitting around and Paul is his name. He says, yeah, I can't believe, you know, in Vietnam that, you know, this guy's seen these bodies and all of a sudden he's getting 100% service connected because he's seen these bodies and it was trauma. Whereas I had to actually, you know, gather up the bodies, bring them in, put them in the cooler, try to get them, you know, cleaned up and all that. And yet, you know, and that didn't do anything to me, you know, and that's what I mean is that, first of all, by the way, I don't believe I didn't do anything to him, but Paul was judging that trauma. He was saying, listen, there was people that were in the jungle getting shot at and killed. They should have trauma. You shouldn't have trauma. All you did is looked in the cooler. But the way that guy's brain was designed, he couldn't handle that. And that's what created that trauma. So again, trauma is trauma. And we're not ever going to try to judge trauma or gauge trauma. And that's what I said. We're not going to judge trauma and we're going to refrain from judgment altogether. And I don't just mean trauma. I mean judging the veteran in general, you know? So for example, you might have a homeless vet who isn't working. We're not going to judge him because he's not seeking services or he's not working or he's living homeless. We're not going to do that because that might be his survival technique right now. And that's what's allowing him to function and not commit suicide or do other things. And so we don't want to be judgmental in any way about how far somebody may have fallen. And we don't want to compare one person to the other. You know, well, this guy's doing great. Why aren't you doing that way? We're just not going to do that because we're looking at individual people. And if we don't understand that about the trauma, then we won't understand about the judgment. So I really want to make sure you understand that we don't judge and we make sure we understand their trauma. Okay, I talked about this, about asking a question and listening, okay? So when I say ask a question and listen, here are some really, really good examples of questions you can ask and listen to and see where they're at. So what branch were you in? That's an immediate and easy question. What branch were you in? I was in the Air Force. I was in the Coast Guard. I was in the National Guard. When did you serve? You know, what years? Because there's going to be a difference, isn't there, between somebody that served in the Korean War, somebody that served in the Vietnam War, and somebody that was in Operation Desert Storm, or somebody that was in the operations currently active now. You know, that's going to make a huge effect of it. Where were you stationed? That's another one. You know, where did you go? Because everybody has a duty station they went to. What was your MOS? That's the job I was talking about. Ask them about their job. Ask them what they worked on. Ask them where they were at. Now, one of the key things I want to point out to you when we talk about this is where were you stationed? When did you serve? When you ask them about that, when did you serve? And where you're stationed, all that. This is again about being judgmental. So I want to kind of touch on this because I think it's important. So whenever we do these presentations, well, I'll use this example instead. When David does these presentations, David's a Marine, okay? And he used to do these presentations with another guy in the Air Force named Scott Swain. And so whenever they did these kind of presentations and they talked about combat or they talked about all these things, what ended up happening is they would automatically assume that David was the one that had seen combat, when in reality, David was really just a law clerk in the Marines, and he didn't even have to go overseas. He was in San Diego his whole time in the Marines. You know, whereas Scott, who was in the Air Force, he saw more combat than anybody else, you know? And so that's one of those things we look at. You want to allow the veteran to explain, okay? So when you say, what was your MOS? Let him explain what that is. Okay, which is military. I can't remember. I'll have to look it up myself. But he'll know. He'll know most of those. And the thing is, if you don't understand it, when he says, you know, yeah, this was my MOS. You know, if you say, what was your job? And he said, this was my MOS. If you don't know what MOS means, ask him. You know, that's part of him what that. You know, ask him to explain what that means. Show interest, meaning that when you're doing this, don't be distracted. If you're doing this and you're asking questions, don't be over here typing on your computer and going, oh, okay, yeah. Look them in the eye and show interest. Show them that you're connected and that you care and that you really want to hear what their stories they have. What this is going to do is build rapport between you and the soldier. If you don't build that rapport, you're never going to have that connection that you want to get. And I hate to say this, but you have very limited opportunities to do this. So when we talk about showing interest, okay, when we're talking about that, the reason why we really want to make sure you show this interest is because if you do not do this, it will not build that rapport. And like I said, once you break those opportunities, so I always tell people that when you're working with a veteran, you're going to have these different windows of opportunity, just like in life. And what ends up happening is every time you pass that window of opportunity, that window gets a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. So he comes in your office and you start asking him some of these questions and he can tell that you're trying to multitask. He can tell that you're over here typing. Well, guess what you've done? You just created this window and it just got smaller now. So maybe the next time he comes in and you ask him a question, he's going to think, yeah, I don't think they really care because of last time. And that's because that window of opportunity has gotten smaller. And that's what I really want to stress is that if you want to build a rapport, you have to do it honestly. If you don't do an honest rapport building, then it's going to look like you're just trying to con them. And that's not going to go over well. When we build the rapport, it's going to lessen your resistance. Now, remember what I just said about if you don't build rapport? What do you think is going to happen if you don't build rapport? We know building rapport lessens resistance. Not building rapport is going to increase resistance. And when we increase resistance, it makes your job harder. It makes your job harder to operate with risk, need, responsivity needs to change behaviors. And that's what we're here to do. When we talk about veterans and veterans treatment court, or treatment courts in general, what we're really looking to do is change behaviors. And the way you're going to do that is by showing interest, building rapport, and then that lessens resistance, which helps you to continue on. A lot of people don't understand that with veterans, when you don't do that, you're really closing those windows. Okay, I'm fine. I don't know if we have any therapists in the audience, but what does it mean when somebody says I'm fine? If you guys want to type that in the Q&A, maybe give that a second. Does anybody know what I'm fine means in therapy talk? No, maybe yes, possibly. All right, well, I'll give the definition that I was taught by a professor in my master's program. He said, anytime somebody comes in and says, I'm fine, it means, and I'm not going to swear because he swore, but I will not. He said it means effed up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. That's what he said that meant. And so over many years of working with clients, if they come in and they say, I'm fine, it's almost like an automatic opening that they're not fine. I would go so far as to say, when people say I'm fine, it almost always means the exact opposite. Okay? Have you ever seen somebody and you say, you can tell they're visibly upset, they're visibly shaken and hurt, and you ask them, how are you doing? Are you okay? And they go, I'm fine. What that is their brain doesn't want to deal with something right now, and so it's closed it down, and it's putting up a barrier and a wall. Now, go back one slide, please. Oh yeah, remember that lessens resistance? If you haven't showed an interest, build a rapport and lessen that resistance when you ask them something about how they're doing and you're trying to show genuine concern, what they're gonna say is, I'm fine. And that's trying to close you out. And a lot of times, that's because you didn't do these. If you haven't showed interest, build rapport, and lessen resistance, they're gonna shut you out. You can go back to the next slide now. I'm fine is a closeout. If when you say, come on, man, let's talk about it a little bit more, tell me what's going on. And if they still won't do it, then that means that resistance is pretty strong. And you're going to have to go back to those other three and start building on that until they get to a point where they'll trust you. They might always say, I'm fine, but if you do a little gentle probing, that should start to open up and come across, But again, if you haven't done the first part of it, if you haven't done your homework at the beginning, then you're not going to get that. You're not going to get that in any way, shape, or form. Embrace the suck. We talked about that, didn't we? Embrace the suck. That's where no matter what, I have to accomplish my mission. No matter what, I embrace the suck. I'm telling you right now, I have met so many people that refuse to go get mental health therapy because they just think they have to embrace the suck, or they have messed up value systems from growing up that men don't cry, or all these things that we've programmed people into. And embracing the suck for the military is one of the big ones. If you can't get them to let go of some of that embracing the suck, you're going to have a very, very, very hard time getting them to start lowering those defenses and trusting people. And the next one is even worse. Go ahead. Pain is weakness leaving the body. So I'm going to tell you a story, okay? And my stepdad is not, well, he wasn't intentionally abusive, okay? And I don't know how to put that any other way except for I don't think he meant to be abusive, but one of his big rules is if you're not bleeding, you shouldn't be crying, And so what ended up happening is I ended up breaking my leg when I was about 12. Okay, and my friends carried me home, and my dad was there, and I didn't cry. I didn't cry at all. And they took me to the emergency room. He looked at my leg and went, oh God, yeah, we got to go get you fixed up. Took me to the emergency room, got me in the emergency room. The doctor was in there, the nurses were in there. And I looked up at him and I said, is it okay to cry now, Dad? Because I really believe when he said that, even though he was doing it in a joking manner, you don't cry unless you're bleeding. He felt so horrible. Because number one, the doctors and nurses looked at him like he was horrible, because that's what I said. Is it okay if I cry now? Because I'm not bleeding, and you said I shouldn't cry unless I'm bleeding. He felt like this big, okay? And he was joking about that stuff when he said it, but it didn't matter that he was joking. It mattered that that's what I heard. And that was a belief system I thought was true. Now imagine going through, you know, basic training where you're torn down and you're reprogrammed to believe that pain is weakness leaving the body. You embrace the suck and you do what you have to do. You complete your mission, okay? So then when I do have pain, it's much, much harder for me to seek out services and help, because I keep thinking if I seek out services, I'm just being weak. If I seek out services, I'm just being weak. So again, you have got to connect with these guys in a certain way, or they're never going to have that opening to talk to you and be there with you and open up. And so I really want to stress how vital it is. We can have services that identify them. We can identify the veteran with VRSS or self-reporting or having it on the intake forms for booking. We can identify the veteran. But when we're talking about in this presentation about identifying the veteran, we're talking about identifying in a way that you can connect and start working with the veteran in a way that's going to help them. And this is part of this, is understanding these things, understanding the culture they come from and where they're coming from. Remember before I said, I don't want you to say, I understand how you feel or anything like that? We don't ever want to say that, okay? So I was working with another therapist in my graduate school, and it wasn't a very good therapist, okay? But I'll never forget the day when he was sitting with a client, and the client said, yeah, I had a really hard childhood, and you know, he was just starting to talk. He was just starting to kind of open up and letting somebody know what he was going through. And he was a veteran, and the therapist cut him off in the middle of this. You know, when he was saying, I had a lot of family problems and it was really rough on me, and I didn't know what to do. And the therapist said, yeah, I understand how you feel. I had a lot of family problems too. And the guy looked at him and said, oh, your dad raped you too every day? And the therapist stopped, because he didn't have that. And he couldn't understand that was. And even if his dad had done something that horrible to him, he still couldn't understand, because everybody's experience is different. Every trauma is different. Everybody thinks that. So you don't ever want to say, I understand. You know, matter of fact, I would even go so far as to say, it's safer to say, I don't understand what you're going through, but here's something I went through. But you only do that once they're done. Because remember what we talked about before? We talked about you have to listen. You have to listen. That therapist was too busy trying to make a connection and not busy enough listening. If he would have just listened for a while and then said, you know, I don't understand anything that could have happened to you like that, but this is what my childhood was like, and this is what I want you to know about me. Now let's work together. That would have been a successful way to do it. But just saying, I understand, is probably one of the most horrible ways to touch to a client, because it almost always isolates them. Okay, you guys know, if you have any questions during this, you can type them in and I'll answer them too. And at the end, I'll answer questions too. But either way, you can do that all the way through. Okay? Can cause withdrawal and anger. So I want to go into a little bit about anger, because I think we need to understand anger to understand the veteran. Okay? So most people look at anger as a primary emotion. Okay? I don't believe anger is a primary emotion. I believe anger is a reactionary emotion or a take control emotion, but I don't think that we just wake up and we have a feeling of anger. You know, I've never seen that. What I have seen is that what ends up happening is I feel sad. I feel afraid. I feel humiliated. I feel embarrassed. Any of those kind of feelings like that, you know? When I feel those feelings, you know, what ends up happening is I feel those feelings and I have no control. If my girlfriend broke up with me, there's not much I can do except for feeling sad. If I did something stupid and I feel humiliated and everybody's laughing at me, I don't have a lot of control in that situation. So what we do is we take those feelings and we convert them rather quickly, especially if you're really good at conversion. We convert that into an anger. Because when I'm angry and I have that, now suddenly I can do something. I can say something mean, I can yell, I can punch somebody, I can punch a hole in the wall. Now all of a sudden I have a certain degree of control to try to focus on that emotion. Even though I'm not focusing on the primary emotion, at least I've got some control and at least I can move forward with that. It's going to be a pretty big deal to try to see where that anger is coming from. And that's how you do that, is by working with them and getting them to understand that. But a lot of times when people are working with veterans and they have these moments of anger, they think the veteran is doing it intentionally, to be a bully, to be a jerk, and it's just not true. A lot of times what's happened is they're converting all these other emotions, often from trauma and PTSD, into something that they can control and something they can work on. Now, another thing people don't always understand is that depression often shows as anger. A lot of times when somebody's depressed, they're not just sitting there moping around and crying and being sad. Oftentimes, especially for veterans and males, when we get depressed, we just get angry. And then we react poorly to things. We get mad quickly. And that's because of that, again, that conversion that we're talking about when we talk about anger. Okay, so when we're looking at that about withdrawal or anger, that's one of those things I want you to look at. And withdrawal is just, I want to get away from something because it's making me look at something that I don't want to. And that's part of this. When we're in this treatment court, you're going to be looking at things that they don't necessarily want to look at, you know, and you're going to be having them go to therapy, and they're going to be dealing with things that they don't necessarily want to look at. And so it's really important that you understand that they're probably dealing with some of the hardest things in their lives, and it's something that they've not wanted to deal with for a very long time. And they've often self-medicated so they didn't have to deal with it. This is a really good way to show concern. How is that for you? I can't imagine what that was like for you. I don't understand what you went through, but here's what I went through. These are really good ways to lower defenses and allow you to make a connection with veterans and allow you to make a rapport with them that you can open up about. We already talked about trauma is trauma, and we're not going to judge trauma. We're going to go into that a little bit more again. But right now, what I want to talk about is I might be on military deployment and I might not have any trauma at all. But I might come home one night and see a kid get ran over, and all of a sudden I have trauma. Or I might have trauma from different things. So one of the things that we see oftentimes is people look for nexus. They'll say, well, we'll take somebody into our treatment court if they can show that their trauma is related to the military. A lot of times people go into the military and have trauma going in. When you ask people why they go in the military, you'll get some people that say, you know, I did it because I want to serve my country, which is great. And I think everybody does want to do that. But you also hear some people say, I joined the military because I wanted to get out of my house. Because they had a horrible trauma incidences going on in their house, and the military was a good escape. You know, and so they might have trauma that they're dealing with from their house, their home, before they came in the military, and then the military could very easily exacerbate it or made it worse. So we need to remember that, again, you can have trauma without it being military or deployment related. You know, a good example of trauma that is not about deployment would be military sexual trauma, you know, where they're sexually assaulted in the military. So the way we can do this is we can start asking about painful experiences they may have had apart from deployment or before their service. I want to stress this because this is an important thing. We are not asking you to become counselors or therapists. We understand you know your role and we understand where you're at, you know, but sometimes, you know, asking some questions and letting them talk is a great thing to do. Now, I want you to ask, you know, was somebody raped or something like that? No. You know, I don't think you're qualified for that. And I would worry that the answer you might get, you wouldn't react in a way that would be helpful, and it could actually be negative, you know. But asking about, especially for a therapist, asking about painful experiences they may have had apart from deployment or before their service is good to know, you know, because the reason why it's good to know is because it also builds you a trauma pattern, I guess is what to say. So if they, a good way to say, well, how was your childhood growing up? Was it okay, or was there anything going on there? They might say, yeah, my dad was horrible. He beat the crap out of us, or my dad was an alcoholic. That's good information to have, but don't start diving into it and trying to be an armchair therapist. Okay, you can gather that information, but you don't need to go into details with it. Okay, engaging with the trauma should be left to the clinicians, which is what I was just talking about, right? That we're not, you can talk about whether or not they had trauma so you can get an idea for risk, need, and responsivity, but you need to leave the engagement with the trauma directly to the therapist. Refrain from judgment. I think I've stressed this, but we're going to go over it again. This time, judgment is about what they had to do in the military. All right. We don't know what they had to do in those split-second decisions, whether they had to kill somebody or not kill somebody, and we're not going to have judgment on them because of that. We really got to understand that oftentimes they're going to have PTSD and guilt from these things, and so you judging them is not going to help. The same way I talked about you judging them about their current situation, or asking questions like, man, how'd you get so low? Or man, how'd you get this bad? Those are just questions we don't need to ask and we don't want to ask, okay? Because again, they might be coming from a place of goodness and wanting to help, but those kind of questions can really do a lot of harm. This is what I was talking about. These can weigh really heavily on them, and this could really add to their moral injury. So again, you don't know what they had to do and why they had to do it, but oftentimes there's guilt that's associated with it afterwards, and that's really hard on them. Be supportive and empathetic. Hopefully you guys all know what empathetic means, but that basically means is that understand how they could feel the way they feel. Not saying that you feel the same way, right? We already talked about that. We're not going to say, I understand, I feel the same way, because you don't understand and you don't know how they feel, but you can be supportive and empathetic by saying, wow, if I had to go through that, I don't know how I would deal with it. Or, wow, man, what you said sounds like it's really hard. That sounds like it was really rough on you. That's that. And I'm here for you. I understand we're not going to be buddies and best friends, but I'm here to, to help you do your program and get to a better place where you're going to be happier. That's what we're looking at when we're talking about that stuff. Okay, so the question is did we do what we said we were going to do here, guys? Did we engage through the early identification of veterans within the criminal justice system? I think we did. We talked about VRSS. And we also talked about ask often that question, have you ever served in the United States military to include the reserves and the National Guard? And we also talked about different strategies you could do to do that, such as the posters, the business cards, those types of things. The next thing we had was engagement through the innovations means of identification. We did that. Engagement through military and veteran cultural competence. I hope I explained a little bit more about what veteran culture was like and how interacting with it can be important. And that's where we start to talk about developing cultural competence. And then the last thing we did is identified some effective communication skills that you guys can use when working with veterans. Now, the next thing we're going to go to is questions. There we go. Do you guys have any questions? We got like 15 minutes or 20 minutes for questions that we can go through. Abby, Catherine, any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I've really enjoyed your presentation, Mark. I think it was super helpful to understand the mentality. And I think just some of the examples that you gave were really dead on to help me understand just how the perceptions are from veterans. So I think it was really helpful. And I really thank you for sharing like those stories and some of your personal experiences as well.
Oh, well, thank you. Oh, there we go. Military occupational specialty. Thank you. I should know that, but it's been a long time since I was in the military.
No worries. I figured I'd share it since I didn't know it anyway. So I just
You looked it up for me, didn't you?
For myself.
Oh, there's a question. Okay, so do you have any examples of how to help a vet with VA issues that tend to trigger their trauma? So what I guess you're saying, JD, is that just going to the VA is starting to cause that trauma to trigger off, right? So the very first thing I would do is I would say, you don't want to be a therapist, okay? unless you are a therapist. But if you're a case manager or you're working with them in that kind of sense, some of the stuff you can do is you can just slowly talk to them about it and then start just asking them, would it be okay to have a veteran service officer come? I had some stuff happen in my military career, and that's the way I started out by talking to people, is just by going to a VSO, you know, and the veteran service officer can really, it's part of the VA, but it's not at the VA. So that's what my recommendation would be, is to go to a veteran service officer and have them ask the vet if it's okay if the veteran service officer comes for their appointment, you know, maybe just the last part of it. And so then that VSO can start telling them about the VA and getting them ready. The other thing you can do too is most vets or VAs have these offshoots called veteran centers that are, so this is kind of hard to explain. They're not part of the VA, but they're like a part of the VA. So they're like a quasi entity of the VA. All right. Vet centers are oftentimes much more welcoming and not so overwhelming as going to a gigantic VA. So that's what my suggestion would be for that, is I would try to get them in contact with a VSO, even if it was only over the phone. You know, have them talk to that veteran service officer over the phone, and then try to see if they would go to a VA clinic or a center. You know, that could be a good way to start. Does that answer that? See right there, we have a veteran service advocate here. He is amazing, has been a resource, and I can come in contact with veterans needing assistance. As a veteran's mother, it's so important that people have this training that you just gave. Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. You know, I really do. It's nice to hear that. I really wish I was in person, because I could call on you guys and make you answer questions. But when you're hiding in the chat, I couldn't. Okay, JD said thanks. And Tina Edwards said in this area. Okay. All right, we can hang out and just talk, guys, and I can answer questions, and, you know, or if you guys got any more, I'm pumped up to do it.
Rachel P. did say that veterans don't always identify, as we're not taught to talk about it like my dad, but I learned he was suffering from PTSD and depression. It was hard to help him when VA denied him services, saying he didn't suffer, etc.
Yeah. So a lot of times, especially, I don't know how old your dad was, but in the older days, it was harder. That's why, you know, sometimes reaching out to a vet center is better than a VA. So for example, one of the reasons why I never identified as a veteran, because I didn't, okay? When I got out of the Air Force for many, many years, I did not identify as a veteran. And the reason why is this. When I went in the military, it was 1989, and I got out in 1991. Okay. The reason why I got out in 91 is because President Clinton did this thing called reduction of service, which meant that you could take a cash buyout and get done early, because they were trying to reduce the forces. It was reduction of forces is what they were trying to do. And so I took that buyout. So I did 3 years, and then I did 5 years in active duty. But because I took that buyout, I never thought I was a veteran. And right now, if I go to the VA center, I don't qualify for any services through the VA center because I didn't have a long enough term. You have to have a little bit longer of a term than what I had. And so, but what I did qualify for was that veteran center, you know, and so that's one of those things that you can look at, is you can go to the veteran center and get services sometimes from there, especially for PTSD. Any other ones?
I have a question, Mark. In your experience with vet centers, do they normally have, do they work with, or do they share resources as far as like veteran legal services, for example, that could help veterans like in the hearing process if they are denied?
Yeah, what they'll do is they'll hook you up usually with a VSO, especially if you have something that's service connected. So for me, I didn't know this until I started working for Justice for Vets, actually. And so I reached out to a VSO about my hearing and stuff because I worked with jet engines and I got this horrible ringing in my ears. And he's the one that got me hooked up with the stuff that I need to get done so I can try to get service connected a little bit with that. You know, but he also directed me to the VSO, the Veteran Center. And so I think that if they can't answer a question directly, they can certainly show you the road to go down.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Abby, you got a question? I'm just picking on Abby because she hasn't said much. She's probably sleeping, Catherine. We both know it. Okay. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the conference. I hope I closed it out in a way that was entertaining for you, and I hope you learned something. And I hope the platform was enjoyable to you. So, but thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Mark. Again, that was such a great presentation and it was super helpful. I'm sure it seems like our participants really enjoyed it as well. And I want to just thank everyone as well for attending our final session, session E4, which was challenges to taking the first step in engaging the veteran population in treatment courts. You may find recordings of all enhancement training sessions and their materials at enhancementtraining.org. And lastly, on behalf of TLPI, I would like to thank you all for attending the 10th Annual Tribal Healing to Wellness Court Virtual Enhancement Training. Thank you, Mark, as well, for honoring us today with your training. And I hope you all enjoyed the virtual conference and that you enjoy the rest of your day and have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
It was my honor to be here.
Thanks, Mark.